Welcome to Chronological Fiction, where real-world events meet the power of storytelling. We're here to breathe new life into history's most interesting moments by turning them into unique narratives. Join our community by subscribing, and let's explore the stories that shaped our world.
Iron Cross of Ice. The last breath of Stalingrad. Before the war, I hunted stags in the Bavarian Alps. My father taught me that patience is a weapon sharper than any knife. You sit in the snow for hours, slowing your heart rate until you are just another rock, just another shadow. You wait for the mistake, the flick of an ear, the snap of a twig. Stalingrad is no different. Except here, the deer shoot back. I lay prone on the fourth floor of a bombed-out department store called the Univermag. My Kar 98K rifle was wrapped in white rags to blend in with the plaster dust and the early snow. Through the scope, the world was a silent grey mosaic of shattered brick and twisted rebar. My name is Friedrich Weber. I am 23 years old, but I feel 50. They call me the Silencer. It's a stupid name. Guns aren't silent. Death is silent. Movement, whispered Hans, my spotter. Hans was a kid from Berlin, barely 19. He still believed in the Führer. He still believed we were going home by Christmas. Where? I asked, not moving my lips. The tractor factory, third window from the left, red brick building. I shifted the scope. Millimeter by millimeter, I saw it, a glint, not a muzzle flash, but the reflection of the sun on glass. A rookie mistake, an optical sight without a sunshade. Range, 400 meters. Wind is crossing left to right, maybe 5 knots. I adjusted the elevation drum. I exhaled half my breath. My world narrowed down to the crosshairs. Patience, Fritz. Become the rock. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. The sound was deafening in the empty room. But down there, 400 meters away, a helmet spun into the air. Hit, Hans said, marking it in his notebook. That makes 42. I didn't feel pride. I felt nothing, just the recoil and the cold brass of the bolt as I cycled a new round. One less enemy. 1 million to go. Chapter 2, Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. We call it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The generals look at maps and see lines. They see the 6th Army controls the city center. They are lying, or they are blind. In Stalingrad, nobody controls anything. We hold the kitchen, the Russians hold the living room. We hold the 3rd floor, they hold the basement. You can drill a hole in the floor to throw a grenade and hear Russians singing folk songs underneath you. We moved out of the Univermag at dusk. The orders were to secure a grain elevator near the Volga River. It was a monolith of concrete, towering over the burning city like a tombstone. We moved through the sewers to avoid the snipers. The sewers of Stalingrad are a nightmare beneath a nightmare. The water is freezing sludge mixed with oil, blood, and excrement. The rats here are the size of cats. They are the only ones winning this war. They feast on German and Russian alike. It smells like death down here, Hans gagged, covering his nose with a scarf. Get used to it, I muttered. Death is the perfume of this city. Suddenly, the point man stopped. He held up a fist. We froze. Splash, splash. Footsteps ahead, echoing in the pipe. Ivans? Hans whispered, his eyes wide in the gloom. Maybe. I unslung my MP40 submachine gun, too tight for the rifle here. Or maybe just another lost patrol. Then a burst of light. A flamethrower. The tunnel ahead turned into a dragon's throat. The orange fire rolled toward us, consuming the oxygen, screaming like a living thing. Back! Fall back! I screamed. We scrambled over each other, slipping in the filth as the heat singed our eyebrows. This wasn't war, this was slaughter in a toilet. Chapter 3. The grain elevator. We survived the sewer, but only half of us made it to the grain elevator. The building was a fortress. The concrete walls were so thick that artillery shells just bounced off, leaving black scorch marks. Inside, the air was thick with grain dust. It coated our lungs, our eyes, our sweat. We looked like ghosts covered in white powder. The fighting was room to room. No, silo to silo. We were on the 5th floor. The Russians were on the 3rd and 7th. We were the meat in the sandwich. For 3 days, we didn't sleep. We didn't eat. We just fought. They attacked us with shovels when they ran out of ammo. They attacked us with broken bottles. I saw a Russian soldier, his arm blown off, still trying to bite the throat of my sergeant. They fight like demons. They are protecting their motherland. We are fighting for… what? A spot on a map? On the third night, the grain caught fire. Smouldering grain doesn't burn quickly. It smokes. A thick, acrid smoke that fills the silo. Gas masks, the lieutenant ordered. We put on the rubber masks. Now we were alien insects, fighting in the dark, breathing through filters. I sat in a corner, clutching my rifle. I was so tired I was hallucinating. I saw the deer from Bavaria running through the smoke. Fritz, Hans shook me. He was wearing his mask, his voice muffled. You're sleeping. I'm resting my eyes, I lied. If you sleep, they come up the stairs, and they cut our throats. He was right. In Stalingrad, sleep is the cousin of death. Chapter 4. The Volga. From the roof of the grain elevator, you can see the Volga River. It is wide, black, and cold. It is the lifeline of the Russian army. Every night, hundreds of boats cross it, bringing fresh troops, ammo, and food to the city. We bomb them. We strafe them with Stukas. The river turns red, but they keep coming. It is like trying to stop the tide with a spoon. I set up my position on the roof. It was windy and exposed, but it gave me a view of the riverbank. Target-rich environment, the lieutenant said, handing me a box of armor-piercing ammunition. Stop the officers. Stop the commissars. I looked through the scope. I saw them unloading crates. I saw a man in a long coat waving a pistol, urging men forward. Breath in, breath out, pause, crack. The man in the coat fell into the icy water. The soldiers around him didn't stop, they didn't even look. They just stepped over him and kept running toward the ruins. It terrified me. How do you defeat an enemy that doesn't care if it lives or dies? They are endless, Hans whispered, watching through his binoculars. Like ants. Ants have a queen, I said, cycling the bolt. These men have nothing but hate. That night, I wrote a letter to my mother. Dear Mama, the city is falling. We will be home soon. The weather is getting colder, but I have a warm coat. Don't worry about me. The food is good. I looked at the piece of hard, moldy bread in my pocket. I looked at the frozen corpse of a comrade in the corner, waiting to be moved. I folded the letter. Lies. It was all lies, but the truth would kill her faster than a bullet. Chapter 5. The Horizon Burns. November 19th, 1942. A date etched in blood. We woke up to a sound we had never heard before. It wasn't the usual artillery. It was a roar, a continuous rolling thunder coming from the north and south flanks. What is that? Hans asked, shivering in the dawn light. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees overnight. The true Russian winter had arrived. Artillery, I said, listening to the deep bass thumping. Thousands of guns. Ours. I looked at the horizon. The sky was lit up with flashes, but they weren't coming from our lines. They were coming from the Romanian flanks, the weak points of our army. No, I said, a cold stone forming in my stomach. Theirs. The rumors started flying by noon. Breakthrough, encirclement, Operation Uranus. The Russians weren't just attacking the city anymore. They were attacking the armies around the city. They were closing the jaws of a giant trap. And we were the bait inside. The lieutenant came in. He looked pale. He had shaved, but his hand was shaking. Pack your gear, he said. We are moving back to the factory district. We need to consolidate. Are we retreating, sir? Someone asked. No, the lieutenant snapped. We are repositioning. The Führer has ordered us to stand fast. Fortress Stalingrad. Fortress. A fortress has walls to keep the enemy out. But looking at the burning horizon, I realized we were building walls to keep ourselves in. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The word first traveled through the ranks not as a shout, but as a terrifying whisper, passed from frozen lip to frozen lip like a contagion worse than typhus. Eingekesselt, encircled. The trap had snapped shut. The iron pincers of the Soviet Operation Uranus had met at Kalach, kilometers to our rear, sealing the 6th Army inside a tomb of snow and rubble. We were no longer an army conquering a city. We were inmates in a prison with no walls, only horizons that spat fire. We were told not to worry. The High Command in Berlin, in their warm offices with oak desks and cigars, promised us an air bridge. Luftbrücke. They said Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would supply us from the sky. They promised 500 tons of supplies a day, fuel, ammunition, schnapps and bread. We looked up at the grey, leaden sky, searching for the swarms of Junkers 52 transport planes that would save us. But what came was not a swarm, it was a trickle. A few ragged planes struggling against the blizzard, dropping canisters that often blew into the Volga or landed in the Russian lines, giving our enemies our own food while we starved. The promised 500 tons turned out to be a lie. On good days, we got 100 tons. On bad days, we got nothing but the howling wind. I remember standing near the Gumrak airfield, watching the last medical evacuation plane taking off. It was overloaded, its engines screaming in protest against the icy air. Desperate men, wounded men with gangrenous limbs, men blinded by shrapnel, were clinging to the landing gear, begging to be taken. They were kicked off by the field police, Feldgendarmerie, the dogs of war. "Let go," they screamed. "Overweight." "Let go!" I watched a soldier with no legs being dragged away from the wheels, leaving trails of blood in the snow. The plane lifted off, banking slowly into the mist, carrying the lucky few back to the warmth of Germany. Those of us left on the ground watched it disappear with a mixture of hatred and longing. We knew then, with a sinking certainty in our guts, that we were not defenders of a fortress. We were the sacrificial lambs left on the altar of the Führer's ego. The Kessel was not a strategic position, it was a graveyard waiting for its occupants to lie down. Chapter 7, Horse Soup. Hunger changes a man. It is not just an emptiness in the stomach, it is a fundamental rewriting of your humanity. At first, you think about your favorite meals, the roast pork with dumplings my mother made on Sundays, the thick beer of Bavaria. Then you stop thinking about meals and start thinking about ingredients. A potato, a crust of bread, a spoonful of lard. Finally, the mind devolves into the primitive. You look at a leather belt and wonder if you can boil it soft enough to chew. You look at a stray dog and see a feast. We had run out of proper rations weeks ago. The daily allowance was now 200 grams of bread, if you could call it bread. It was a brick of sawdust, mold and flour, frozen so hard you had to hack it with a bayonet. Then came the order. Slaughter the draft animals. The Sixth Army had thousands of horses, beautiful, strong beasts that had pulled our artillery all the way from the Polish border. Now they were standing in the snow, ribs showing, their breath freezing in plumes of steam. I was assigned to the butchery detail near the Red October factory. It was a scene from a Hieronymus Bosch painting. The horses were too weak to panic. They simply stood there, heads low, waiting for the hammer or the bolt. I watched Sergeant Muller walk up to a grey mare. He patted her neck, whispering something soft, an apology perhaps, before putting his Luger behind her ear. Crack, the great beast collapsed. Before the body even hit the ground, we were on it. There was no dignity in it. We were wolves in grey uniforms. We used bayonets, trench knives, even sharpened shovels to hack away the meat. The blood that spilled onto the snow steamed for seconds before turning into red ice. We didn't cook the meat properly. There was no wood for fires. We threw chunks of horseflesh into helmets filled with melted snow, boiling it over tiny flames fueled by furniture scraps or books looted from the Russian library. The soup was grey, greasy, and tasted of despair. It lacked salt. It lacked vegetables. But to us, it was ambrosia. I remember chewing on a piece of gristle, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I felt human again. But as I looked around the circle of men, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, grease smearing their chins, I realized we were no longer the proud Wehrmacht. We were a pack of starving animals, and the winter had only just begun. Chapter 8, The White Ghost, the Nemesis. The Russians have a saying. The sniper is the only one who has time in war. Everyone else is rushing. Rushing to attack, rushing to retreat, rushing to die. But the sniper waits. He steals time. By December, the front lines had solidified into a jagged scar of ruins. We held one building, they held the next. The space between was no man's land, a killing zone where nothing moved and lived. It was in this frozen wasteland that he appeared. We didn't know his name. We called him the White Ghost. Der Weiße Geist. It started with the officers. A lieutenant shot through the neck while lighting a cigarette behind a wall he thought was safe. A captain shot through the eye while looking through binoculars. The ghost didn't miss. He didn't take body shots, he took headshots. He was surgical. He was sending a message. Hans and I were tasked with hunting him. It was a game of cat and mouse, played in a city of 1,000,000 hiding places. We set up in the ruins of the Barricadi gun factory. It was a labyrinth of twisted steel girders and shattered machinery, a jungle of rusted metal. "He's out there," Hans whispered, peering through a periscope we had rigged up. "I can feel him." "Don't feel," I scolded, adjusting the focus on my Zeiss scope. "Look. Look for the unnatural. A shadow that moves against the sun. A bird that doesn't fly." We waited for 6 hours. My limbs were numb. I had to urinate, but I just let it go in my trousers. Warmth for a second, then freezing cold. Movement was death. Then Hans made a mistake, a fatal rookie mistake born of exhaustion. He saw a glimmer in a pile of rubble across the courtyard, a tin can reflecting the light, and he thought it was a scope. He shifted his position to get a better angle. He lifted his head maybe 2 inches above the parapet. There was no sound at first, just a wet thwack like a melon being dropped on pavement. I didn't turn to look. I knew what had happened. Hans slumped back against the wall. There was a neat small hole in his forehead, right below the rim of his helmet. The back of his head was gone, painting the rusted machinery behind him in red and grey. The crack of the rifle reached us a second later. A Mosin Nagant. The sound echoed off the factory walls, mocking me. I didn't cry. Tears would freeze on my cheeks. I just lay there staring at Hans's cooling body and felt a cold rage settle in my heart. The ghost was real, and now it was personal. I stayed in that position for another hour, not moving a muscle, memorizing the building across from me. "I will find you," I promised the silence. "I will put a bullet in your eye, just like you did to my brother." Chapter 9, Christmas in Hell, Stalingrad, Madonna, December 24th, 1942. Heiligabend, Holy Eve. Back in Bavaria, the villages would be buried in snow, but the windows would be glowing with warm golden light. There would be goose roasting in the oven, the smell of cinnamon and pine needles in the air, and children singing carols. Here, in the cellar of the doctor's house where our squad was holed up, the air smelled of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and stale tobacco. We tried to celebrate. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking attempt to hold on to civilization. Someone had found a small pine branch stripped from a tree destroyed by artillery. We stuck it in a shell casing filled with dirt. We didn't have candles, so we used a wick floating in a tin of pork fat. It gave off a sputtering, smoky light that cast long, dancing shadows on the peeling walls. Our feast was a slice of horse sausage, saved for weeks for this occasion, and a bottle of vodka looted from a dead Russian. We passed the bottle around in silence. Then Kurt, a young medical officer who was also an artist, unveiled something he had been working on. He had drawn it on the back of a captured Russian map using a piece of charcoal. It was a picture of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. But she didn't look like the divine figures in the churches. She looked like a refugee. She looked like a mother wrapping her child against the cold. Beneath the drawing, he had written 3 words: Licht, Leben, Liebe. Light, life, love. And around the edge, Weihnachten im Kessel, 1942. Christmas in the Cauldron, 1942. We stared at that drawing. Hardened killers, men who had slaughtered horses and shot enemies in the face, began to weep. We didn't sob loudly, we wept silently, tears tracking through the dirt on our faces. It was the contrast that broke us, the absolute purity of that image against the absolute filth of our reality. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It was a broadcast from Berlin. Joseph Goebbels' voice filled the room, shrill and fanatical. "To our heroes on the Volga," he screamed. "You are the iron shield of Germany. You celebrate in high spirits, knowing the Führer is with you." We looked at each other. High spirits? We were dying. We were eating horses. We were freezing. "Turn it off," the sergeant growled. "Turn that liar off." Someone switched off the radio. In the silence that followed, a single voice began to sing. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." We all joined in. Our voices were cracked, hoarse, and out of tune. But we sang. We sang to drown out the artillery. We sang to drown out the lies from Berlin. We sang because it was the only thing we had left. It was the saddest sound I have ever heard. Chapter 10. Frozen Fingers. January brought a cold that defied description. The thermometer dropped to -30, then -40. At -40, the world changes. Metal becomes brittle and snaps like glass. Oil turns into a thick, useless glue. If you touch bare metal with your skin, it bonds instantly. Pulling away tears the flesh off your hand. We were not equipped for this. Our greatcoats were thin, designed for the mild winters of Western Europe. We stuffed newspapers into our boots. We wrapped our feet in rags taken from the dead. We stole wool shawls from Russian peasant women and wrapped them around our heads, looking like old babushkas with rifles. My Kar 98K, a masterpiece of German engineering, became a useless club. The bolt froze shut. The firing pin spring became sluggish. "Piss on it," the sergeant yelled during a Russian assault. "Piss on the machine guns." It was the only way. The warmth of urine would thaw the mechanism for a few minutes, allowing the MG42 to fire a belt before freezing again. It was degrading, vile, and necessary. We fought with rifles that smelled of urine and hands that were black with frostbite. My fingers were the worst. The tips had turned a waxy white, devoid of sensation. I had to watch my hands to make sure they were doing what I told them. "Load the clip," I commanded my brain. My hands fumbled, the stripper clip slipped, the bullets scattering into the snow. "Pick them up," I tried. But my fingers were like wooden sausages. I couldn't feel the brass cartridges. I clawed at the snow, panicked, weeping with frustration. Across the street, the Russians were advancing. They were wearing white snowsuits, quilted jackets, telogreka, and felt boots, valenki. They moved easily in the cold. The winter was their ally. It was fighting for them. I finally managed to jam a single round into the chamber directly, bypassing the magazine. I aimed, but my eye was tearing up from the cold wind, and the tears froze on my eyelashes, sealing my eye shut. I had to pry my own eyelid open with a dirty fingernail to see the enemy. This wasn't war anymore. It was a biological experiment. How much can a human body endure before it simply stops? I looked at my hand, black and claw-like on the rifle stock. I am already dead, I thought. My body just hasn't realized it yet. Harika. Hikayenin en karanlık, en vahşi ve insanlığın sınırlarının tamamen ortadan kalktığı o döneme giriyoruz. Açlık artık bir fiziksel durum değil, bir delilik hali. Disiplin çöküyor ve avcı ile av arasındaki o son ölümcül dans başlıyor. İşte bölüm 11'den 15'e kadar olan kısım. Paragraflar genişletildi, atmosfer ağırlaştırıldı. Part 3. The Degradation of the Soul. Chapter 11. The Last Airfield. Pitomnik. Pitomnik Airfield was not a military base anymore. It was the waiting room for hell. By mid-January, it was the only umbilical cord connecting us to the Reich, and it was fraying with every passing hour. I was sent there not to evacuate, but to guard the perimeter against our own men. The desperation had turned seasoned veterans into a frantic, clawing mob. The runway was a chaotic scar in the snow, littered with the burning wreckage of Junkers 52 transports that had been strafed by Russian yaks or had simply given up the ghost in the freezing air. The ground was strewn with frozen corpses, men who had died waiting for a ticket home. They were stacked like cordwood, stiff and blue, their eyes open and staring at the sky that had betrayed them. I watched a transport plane taxiing for takeoff. It was the last hope for hundreds of wounded men lying on stretchers in the snow. But the plane was already full. The pilot revved the engines, the propellers whipping up a blinding blizzard of ice crystals. Suddenly, a wave of walking wounded, men with bandaged heads, frostbitten feet, and eyes wild with panic, surged forward. They ignored the shouting MPs. They ignored the warning shots fired into the air. They threw themselves at the moving plane. I saw a man with one arm try to grab the door strut. He slipped. The rear wheel crushed his chest with a sickening crunch, but no one stopped. Others clung to the wings, to the landing gear, to any surface they could grasp. As the plane lifted off, banking sluggishly into the grey clouds, I saw dark shapes falling from the fuselage. Men dropping 200 feet to their deaths, preferring to die on impact rather than freeze to death in the Kessel. It was the end of hope. The gate was closing. Chapter 12. The Highways, the Betrayed. In the shadows of our defeat, there lived a group of men whose fate was even crueler than ours. The Hiwis, Hilfswillige. These were Russian volunteers, POWs who had chosen to serve the Wehrmacht rather than starve in the camps. They drove our trucks, carried our ammo, and dug our graves. They wore mismatched German uniforms stripped of insignia, looking like tragic scarecrows. We despised them because they were turncoats. The Russians despised them because they were traitors. They existed in a purgatory of universal hatred. I shared a foxhole for a night with a Hiwi named Nikolai. He was a small man with a face like a dried apple and sad, intelligent eyes. He spoke broken German, trembling not just from the cold, but from a terror I couldn't imagine. He knew that for me, capture meant a Siberian gulag, a chance, however slim, of survival. For him, capture meant immediate execution, a bullet to the back of the neck by the NKVD. Stalin, no forgive, he whispered, rubbing his frozen hands over a tiny fire made of ammunition crates. Hitler, no care. We are dust, Fritz, just dust. He shared his last crust of bread with me. It was an act of kindness that shamed me. The next morning, during a mortar barrage, a piece of shrapnel took his jaw off. I watched him bleed out in the snow, unable to speak, unable to scream. I didn't bury him. The ground was too hard. I just covered him with a tarp. He was a man with no country, dying for a cause that viewed him as subhuman, killed by the people he had abandoned. Chapter 13. The Meat of the Dead. There are rumors in every war, dark whispers that you dismiss as campfire ghost stories. But in Stalingrad, the rumors became reality. We had eaten the horses, we had eaten the dogs, we had eaten the rats. There was nothing left. The supply drops were canisters of useless medals or summer uniforms, a cruel joke from Berlin. The hunger was a physical pain, a gnawing beast that ate you from the inside out. It made your teeth loose in your gums, it made your belly swell, it made you look at your comrades not as brothers, but as meat. I was patrolling near the ruins of the Red October factory when I smelled it. A scent so distinct, so primal, that it stopped me in my tracks. Cooking meat. Sweet, rich, pork-like. I followed the smell into the basement of a shattered apartment block. Inside, huddled around a pot boiling over a fire, were 3 soldiers from an infantry division. They looked up at me with feral eyes, guilt and aggression warring on their faces. I looked into the pot. I didn't want to see, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't horse. The bones were too familiar. The shape of a rib, the curvature of a femur. One of the soldiers, a skeletal man with a bandage over one eye, stood up, hand hovering over his knife. "Walk away, sniper," he rasped. "Just walk away." I backed out of the room, my stomach heaving, bile rising in my throat. I didn't report them. Who would I report them to? God? God had left Stalingrad months ago. I sat in the snow outside and wept, not for the dead, but for the living who had lost their souls to keep their bodies breathing. Chapter 14. The Basement Duel. I was scavenging for ammunition in the cellars of a bombed-out theater when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in the air pressure, a presence. I froze, my hand halfway to a crate of grenades. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, illuminated only by shafts of grey light filtering through holes in the ceiling. He is here, the white ghost. I didn't know how he found me. Maybe he had been tracking my footprints in the fresh snow. Maybe he smelled my fear. I dropped to the floor, rolling behind a concrete pillar, just as a bullet chipped the masonry where my head had been a second before. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. German, a voice echoed from the dark, deep, calm, Russian. "You are cold?" I didn't answer. I pulled my knife. My rifle was useless at this range. The barrel was too long to swing in the tight corridors. This would be intimate. I crawled through the debris, moving silently over broken glass and frozen rags. I circled left, flanking his position. I heard him breathing, a slow, rhythmic rasp. He was wounded? Or maybe just old? I lunged around the corner, knife raised. He was ready. He swung his Mosin Nagant like a club, the wooden stock smashing into my ribs. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs. I slashed blindly, my blade catching the thick wool of his coat. We fell to the floor, rolling in the dust. He was strong, smelling of garlic and raw onions. His hands found my throat. I looked into his eyes, steel grey, unblinking, devoid of hate, filled only with grim duty. I jammed my thumb into his eye socket. He roared and released me. I scrambled back, grabbing my pistol. He rolled into the darkness before I could fire. We lay there in the silence for 10 minutes, both panting, both bleeding. "Next time, Fritz," he whispered from the gloom. And then he was gone, slipping away like smoke through a ventilation shaft. He knew my name. The hunt had just become a duel. Chapter 15. Surrender is Treason, January 30th, 1943. The 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power. The irony was suffocating. While Berlin celebrated with speeches and parades, we were eating sawdust and freezing in our own filth. General Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal by radio. We all knew what it meant. No German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive. It was an order to commit suicide, a polite way of saying, die for the glory of the narrative. But the narrative was broken. The sky was filled with white flakes, but not snow. Leaflets. Russian propaganda leaflets dropped by the thousands. German soldiers, your commanders have abandoned you. You are dying for nothing. Surrender and you will be fed. You will live. The paper was soft. Many men used it for toilet paper, but others hid it in their tunics, reading it like a holy text. The unit began to fracture. The fanatics, the SS attached to our unit, roamed the lines, shooting anyone who looked like they were giving up. I saw a young boy, barely 17, tie a white handkerchief to his bayonet. He stood up, crying, walking toward the Russian lines. "Mama," he sobbed, I'm coming." A single shot rang out, not from the Russians, from behind us. The lieutenant lowered his pistol. "Traitor," he spat. The boy fell face forward into the snow. The white handkerchief turned red. I looked at the lieutenant. I looked at the dead boy. And for the first time, I realized that the enemy wasn't just in front of us. The enemy was the uniform I was wearing. The enemy was the madness that demanded we die to save the pride of a man in Berlin who had never seen a frozen limb in his life. The Kessel was collapsing, and loyalty was the first casualty. The retreat from the outskirts had pushed us back to the twisted skeletal remains of the Gumrak railway station. It was a place where hope had gone to die, frozen in the grotesque tableau of a failed evacuation. On the rusted tracks, buried up to their axles in snowdrifts, stood a long line of freight cars and hospital wagons. They were meant to carry the wounded to safety, to the warm hospitals of Berlin or Vienna. Instead, the engines had frozen, the fuel had run dry, and the tracks had been severed by Soviet artillery. Now they were steel coffins. Curiosity, or perhaps a morbid desire to see the face of total abandonment, drew me toward the hospital train. The doors of the first wagon were slid open a crack. I squeezed through, the metal searing my skin through my thin uniform. The smell hit me instantly, not the rotting smell of the battlefield, but the preserved, sterile scent of frozen death. Inside, the wagon was full. Bunks stacked 3 high were occupied by men wrapped in grey blankets and bloody bandages. They looked peaceful, almost as if they were sleeping. I shook the shoulder of a man near the door, a sergeant with a bandaged head. He was rock hard, a solid block of ice. They had all frozen to death in their sleep. The doctors had fled on the last planes, leaving hundreds of sedated men to the mercy of a -30-degree night. I walked down the aisle, a ghost among statues. Some had their eyes open, staring at the ceiling with a frosted glaze. Some were huddled together for warmth that never came. In the corner, I found a young soldier, his legs amputated, clutching a framed photograph of a girl in a summer dress. The glass of the frame was cracked, just like the promise made to these men. I backed out of the wagon, shivering violently, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that the Third Reich was not a machine of efficiency. It was a machine that ground its own children into meat and left them to spoil in the dark. Chapter 17. The last stripper clip. I had 5 rounds left. Just one stripper clip of 7.92mm Mauser ammunition, 5 pieces of brass and lead that represented the sum total of my power in this world. For weeks I had rationed them like water in a desert, saving them for high-value targets. An officer, a radio man, a machine gunner. But now, as the Russian shouting grew louder from the ruins of the tractor factory across the street, I realized these bullets were no longer currency for killing the enemy. They were a question I had to answer. Do I use them to take 5 more of them with me, or do I save the last one for myself? I sat in the corner of a shattered apartment block, sheltered from the biting wind by a fallen piano. My rifle, my faithful Kar 98K, lay across my lap. We had been together since Poland. I knew every scratch on its stock, every quirk of its bolt action. It was an extension of my arm. But now it was a liability. If the Russians caught a sniper with his weapon, the death would be slow. They would skin me. They would break my fingers one by one. I made a decision. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of capturing the silencer, but I wouldn't commit suicide either. My mother's Catholic voice echoed in my head. Suicide is a mortal sin, Fritz. Even in hell, I feared damnation. I took the rifle apart. It was a mournful ritual, like dressing a corpse. I removed the bolt and hurled it into a deep snowdrift in the courtyard. I took the Zeiss scope, my beautiful precision-ground glass eye, and smashed it against the brick wall. The sound of the glass breaking was the saddest sound I had heard all winter. Then I took the wooden stock and splintered it under my boot. I stood up, holding only my empty hands. I was no longer a sniper. I was just Fritz Weber, a starving ex-hunter with frostbitten toes and a heart turned to stone. I buried the 5 bullets in a flower pot filled with frozen earth. Let them grow into something else in the spring. I wouldn't need them where I was going. Chapter 18. Cellar 36. The Fall. January 31st, 1943. The end of the world did not come with a bang, but with a shuffle of boots in a basement. We were holed up in the vast labyrinthine cellars of the Univermag department store, the headquarters of Field Marshal Paulus. The atmosphere was suffocating. Thousands of men were packed into the subterranean corridors, coughing, weeping, praying, or simply staring into the void. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, latrine buckets that hadn't been emptied in days, and the cloying sweetness of gangrene. It was a hierarchy of misery. The generals were in their rooms with electric lights and candles, while the soldiers rotted in the hallways. Suddenly, a hush fell over the crowd. It started near the entrance and rippled backward like a wave. They are here. I squeezed forward to see. Soviet soldiers were descending the stairs. They didn't look like the monsters we had been told about. They looked like us. Tired, dirty, wary, but they were well fed. They wore thick fur hats and white camouflage smocks. Their submachine guns were pointed at us, but they didn't fire. Then the door to the inner sanctum opened. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the architect of our doom, emerged. He looked ghostly pale, his face twitching with a nervous tic. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a broken old man who had lost a gamble with the devil. He surrendered his pistol. The spell broke. The Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, ceased to exist. Chaos erupted, not fighting, but a frantic shedding of identity. Men ripped off their rank insignia. SS officers frantically tried to swap uniforms with dead infantrymen to hide their wounds. I saw a colonel sitting on a crate, weeping openly, while a private next to him ate a piece of stale bread, indifferent to history. I sat down against a damp wall and closed my eyes. It was over. The guns were silent, and in that silence, the terror of the unknown future rushed in like a flood. Chapter 19. The long walk. Davai, davai. Move, move. That word became the soundtrack of our new life. The march into captivity began immediately. We were herded out of the ruins of Stalingrad, a column of ghosts stretching for kilometers across the frozen steppe. The wind howled across the flat, white plain, cutting through our ragged uniforms like a razor. There was no food. There was no water. We ate snow, which only lowered our body temperature and hastened the end. The Russians were riding on ponies or driving American-made trucks alongside the column. They were victorious, and they were vengeful. They moved down the line, looking at our wrists. Uhri, uhri, watches, watches. They stripped us of everything. Wedding rings, watches, fountain pens, family photos. If a ring wouldn't come off a frostbitten finger, they didn't use soap, they used a knife. But the looting was the least of our worries. The cold was the executioner. If you stopped walking, you died. If you fell to your knees from exhaustion, a guard would simply walk up and put a bullet in your head. Bang! No anger, just housekeeping. They didn't want to carry stragglers. I walked next to a boy named Gunther. He had lost his boots days ago and had wrapped his feet in strips of carpet. Fritz, he whispered, his voice slurring. I'm so warm, I think spring is coming. I knew what that meant. Paradoxical undressing, the final stage of hypothermia before death. The brain tricks you into thinking you are burning up. Keep walking, Gunther. I grabbed his arm. Don't stop. No, I need to sleep, he smiled, a dreamy, distant smile. He sat down in the snow. Just for a minute. Get up, I screamed, pulling at him. A guard shouted. He raised his rifle. I let go of Gunther. I had to. Survival is a selfish act. I walked on, tears freezing on my cheeks, waiting for the shot. It came a second later. I didn't look back. I just put one foot in front of the other. Davai, davai. Chapter 20. The Cattle Car, Siberia. We reached the railhead at Bekatovka after 3 days of marching. We thought the train would be salvation. We were wrong. They herded us into cattle cars. Wooden boxcars designed for 8 horses or 40 men. They shoved 80, maybe 90 of us into a single car. We were packed so tightly that no one could sit. We stood pressed chest to back, a solid mass of shivering, stinking humanity. Then the heavy sliding doors slammed shut. The darkness was absolute. The train began to move, lurching eastward. Towards Siberia, towards the Gulag. The first day was bad. The thirst was agonizing. Men licked the frost off the metal bolts of the door. The second day was worse. The dysentery started. There were no buckets. Men relieved themselves where they stood. The stench was so thick you could taste it. Ammonia, feces, vomit, and fear. By the third day, people started dying. But the dead couldn't fall. There was no room to fall. They stood there, wedged between the living, swaying with the rhythm of the train. You could feel the cold body of a corpse pressing against your back. You could feel its dead weight leaning on you when the train braked. I was pressed against the wall near a small crack in the wood. I pressed my nose against it, breathing in the freezing air, guarding that tiny sliver of oxygen like a dragon guarding gold. In the center of the car, madness set in. Men started fighting, hallucinating. I heard a scream in the dark, then a wet biting sound. He bit me. He's drinking my blood, someone shrieked. I closed my eyes and prayed to a god I no longer believed in. Just let the train stop. Anywhere, even hell, just let the doors open. The train stopped in the middle of a white void. The heavy doors, frozen shut by the moisture of our breath, were hammered open with sledgehammers. The light that flooded in was blinding. A pure, aggressive whiteness that burned our retinas after weeks of darkness. We spilled out onto the snow like sacks of refuse, stiff, filthy, and blinking. We were in Karaganda, Kazakhstan, the steppes. Here the horizon was infinite, and the wind had traveled thousands of kilometers without hitting a single tree before it hit our faces. It felt like a whip made of ice. Camp 168 was a scar on this pristine landscape. Rows of low wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences 3 meters high. Watchtowers stood at the corners like wooden giants, their machine guns tracking our stumbling column. We were stripped naked in the courtyard. The temperature was -30. Our clothes, infested with lice, were taken to be boiled. We stood there, thousands of skeletons shivering in the wind, our ribs protruding like the rungs of broken ladders. A Russian officer walked down the lines, looking at us with disgust. "You are not soldiers anymore," he shouted. His voice carried by the wind. "You are fascist criminals. You are here to work. If you work, you eat. If you don't work, you die. It is simple arithmetic." They shaved our heads. They painted numbers on our chests with black tar. I was no longer Friedrich Weber. I was number 4921. My past was erased. My medals, my rank, my name, all gone. I was just a unit of labor to be consumed by the Soviet state until I expired. Chapter 22. The soup, the holy water. Life in the Gulag revolved around one singular, obsessive axis. Balanda. The soup. It was served twice a day in rusted metal bowls. It was basically hot water with a few floating cabbage leaves and, if you were lucky, a fish head staring back at you. It had almost no nutritional value, yet men would kill for it. I saw a former professor of philosophy from Heidelberg punch a young boy in the throat because the boy had spilled a few drops of the professor's ration. Hunger stripped away the veneer of civilization faster here than in Stalingrad. In Stalingrad, we were brothers in misery. Here, we were competitors for calories. There was a hierarchy to the soup. The Urkas, the hardened Russian criminals who ran the barracks from the inside, got the thick from the bottom of the cauldron. The potatoes, the gristle, the actual food. We, the fascists, got the water from the top. I learned quickly. I learned to lick my bowl until the metal shone. I learned to keep a piece of bread in my cheek for hours, dissolving it slowly to trick my stomach into thinking it was full. I learned that the most valuable object in the world was not a diamond or a gold watch, but a spoon. If you lost your spoon, you had to lap the boiling soup like a dog, burning your lips and losing dignity. I sharpened a piece of wood into a spoon and tied it around my neck with a piece of string. It hung there against my chest, tapping against my ribs, a constant reminder of who I was. I was a hungry animal. Chapter 23. The Black Fever, Typhus. Spring brought the thaw, and with the thaw came the lice. They were everywhere. In our eyebrows, in the seams of our rags, under our armpits. And with the lice came the typhus. It swept through Barracks 4 like a wildfire. One day, the man on the bunk next to me, a tank driver named Carl, didn't wake up for roll call. His skin was burning hot, his eyes rolling back in his head. 2 days later, I felt the fire in my own blood. The fever was a terrifying, hallucinogenic trip. I lay on the wooden planks, shivering violently, while sweat poured off me. I wasn't in the camp anymore. I was back in the Bavarian forest. The trees were tall and green. My mother was there, wearing a white dress, holding a plate of roast goose. "Eat, Fritz," she smiled. "Why don't you eat?" I reached for the goose, but it turned into a rat, a giant grey rat with the face of Hans, my dead spotter. "You let me die," the rat whispered. "You watched the ghost kill me." I woke up screaming, but no sound came out. My throat was swollen shut. I was too weak to move. I lay there for days, floating in and out of consciousness. I saw the orderlies, fellow prisoners tasked with collecting the dead, walking down the aisle. They grabbed Carl by his feet and dragged him off the bunk. Thump. His head hit the floor. They came for me next. I felt a hand on my ankle. "This one's gone too," a voice said. "No," I tried to say. "No." I mustered every ounce of will I had left. I moved my finger, just one finger. The orderly stopped. "Wait, he's twitching." They left me. That finger saved my life. I had stared into the abyss, and for some reason, the abyss had spat me back out. Chapter 24. The Ghost in the Tower. I survived the typhus, but I was a wreck. I weighed 45 kilos. I walked with a shuffle, dragging my feet to save energy. I was assigned to the logging detail, cutting down trees in the taiga for the Soviet railways. It was brutal work. If you didn't meet your quota, your rations were cut. A cut ration meant death within a week. One afternoon, during a break, I looked up at the watchtower overlooking our sector. The guard up there was not the usual conscript, bored and smoking cheap tobacco. He was standing perfectly still, watching us through binoculars. He held his rifle not like a stick, but like an instrument. Something about his posture was familiar, the way he leaned into the railing, the stillness. Then he lowered the binoculars. I froze. It was him, the white ghost, the nemesis from Stalingrad, the man I had dueled with in the cellar. He was older now, his face lined, but those steel-grey eyes were unmistakable. He wasn't a regular guard. He wore the blue tabs of the NKVD. He was an officer. He was looking directly at me. He knew. Thousands of prisoners, all shaved, all starving, all looking alike. But he knew. A sniper never forgets a silhouette. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just raised a single gloved finger and tapped the side of his nose. "I see you." My blood ran cold. The war was over for everyone else. But for us, the duel had just relocated. Chapter 25. The chess game begins. 2 days later, I was pulled from the work detail. "Number 4921, the camp commandant shouted, "to the administration block." The other prisoners looked at me with pity. Going to the administration block usually meant you didn't come back. It meant interrogation, torture, or a bullet for sabotage. I walked into the office. It was warm. There was a rug on the floor, a picture of Stalin on the wall. Sitting behind the desk was the ghost. He was clean-shaven, wearing a crisp uniform. On the desk, there was a plate of biscuits and a pot of tea. The smell was intoxicating. "Sit," he said in German. His voice was the same deep rumble I remembered from the cellar. I sat on the wooden stool, clutching my cap, trembling. "Do not fear, Fritz," he said. "I am Major Volkov." He pushed the plate of biscuits toward me. "Eat." I looked at the biscuits. Was it a trap? Was it poison? I didn't care. I grabbed one and shoved it into my mouth. It tasted like heaven. Sugar, butter, life. "You were good in Stalingrad," Volkov said, leaning back. 42 confirmed kills at the tractor factory alone. I read your file. Or what was left of it. I swallowed the biscuit. "I was a soldier, like you." "No," Volkov shook his head. "Soldiers fight for land. Snipers fight for souls. We are different." He opened a drawer and pulled out a chessboard. He set it on the desk. "I am bored here, Fritz," he said. "The other officers, they are peasants. They drink vodka and beat prisoners. They have no mind. I need an opponent." He pointed to the board. "Play. If you win, you get an extra ration of bread. If you lose," he let the sentence hang in the air. "If I lose?" I asked, my voice raspy. "If you lose, you go back to the forest. And maybe accidents happen in the forest. Trees fall, guns misfire." He smiled. It was a wolf's smile. "White moves first," he said. I reached for a pawn with my trembling, scarred hand. The game for my life had begun. The chess games became my lifeline, but they were also a torture of a different kind. Twice a week, I was pulled from the freezing hell of the logging camp and brought to Volkov's office. For 2 hours, I was allowed to sit in a chair with a backrest. I was allowed to drink hot tea with a lump of sugar. I was allowed to be a human being. But the price was high. I quickly realized that I was walking a razor's edge. If I played too well and humiliated Volkov, his pride as a Soviet officer would be wounded, and I might find myself facing a firing squad. If I played poorly and let him win easily, I would bore him, and a bored Volkov had no use for a pet German. I would be sent back to the forest to die. So I learned to play for the draw. I learned to create complex, suffocating positions where neither side could advance. A reflection of the war we had both fought. I learned to sacrifice my knights to save his queen, making him feel like a genius while I guided the game to a stalemate. Volkov knew. He was intelligent, dangerously so. Sometimes he would look at me over the rim of his tea glass, his grey eyes piercing through my skull. "You are holding back, Fritz," he would rumble. "You play like a coward, like Paulus." "I play to survive, Major," I would answer, moving a pawn. "Survival is boring," he sneered. "Attack me, show me the wolf that killed 40 men at the tractor factory." But I never did. The wolf was dead. There was only the dog left, begging for a biscuit. These games were not about chess, they were about power. He held my life in his hand like a captured king, and we both knew he could tip it over whenever he pleased. Chapter 27. The Potato Thief. Hunger makes you stupid. It overrides the survival instincts cultivated by years of war and replaces them with a singular, blinding need. It was October 1948. The harvest was coming in from the collective farms, and a truck carrying potatoes had broken down near the camp gates. We were ordered to unload it. The sacks were heavy, rough burlap filled with frozen tubers. As I lifted a sack, I saw a tear in the fabric. A single dirty potato, no bigger than a golf ball, rolled out and fell into the mud. Without thinking, purely on animal impulse, I dropped my knee, scooped it up, and shoved it into my boot. It took 3 seconds. But 3 seconds is a lifetime in the gulag. "Halt!" screamed a guard. The butt of a rifle slammed into my kidneys. I fell face first into the mud. The guards descended on me like vultures. They kicked my ribs, my head, my spine. I curled into a ball, trying to protect the spoon around my neck. Thief, fascist filth. They were about to shoot me. I heard the bolt of a PPSH-41 click back. I closed my eyes, waiting for the flash. "Stop." The voice was quiet, but cut through the violence like a knife. Major Volkov stood there, wearing his greatcoat. He looked down at me, bleeding in the mud. He looked at the potato that had fallen out of my boot. "For this?" he asked, picking up the muddy potato. "You would die for this." I couldn't speak. I spat out a tooth. Volkov looked at the guards. "Get him up. Bring him to my office." He didn't give me the potato. He didn't give me tea. He made me sit in the chair, blood dripping onto his clean floor, and set up the chessboard. "Play," he ordered. I can't see out of one eye, Major," I rasped. "Then use the other one. Play." We played for 3 hours. I was in agony. Every breath was a shard of glass in my chest. But I played. I understood then what he was doing. He wasn't saving me out of kindness. He was claiming ownership. I was his toy. And you don't let the other children break your favorite toy. Chapter 28. Letters from Nowhere, The Silence. Time in the gulag is not measured in hours or days, but in seasons of pain. The snow melts, the mud comes, the mosquitoes come, the snow returns. Years bled into one another. 1949, 1950, 1951. The worst days were the mail calls. Once a month, a sack of letters would arrive from the Red Cross. The camp fell silent. Men who would kill for a piece of bread stood trembling, weeping, clutching photos of children who were now strangers. "Schmidt, here. Müller, here." I stood in the back, waiting for Weber. Every month I waited, and every month silence. I began to forget. First, I forgot the sound of my mother's voice. Was it high? Was it low? Then I forgot the layout of our village. Was the church on the left or the right of the bakery? Finally, I began to doubt my own existence. Maybe Friedrich Weber had died in Stalingrad. Maybe I was just a ghost haunting Siberia. One night, Volkov saw me staring at the blank wall. "No letter again, Fritz?" he asked, moving his bishop. "No, Major." "They have forgotten you," he said cruelly. "Germany is rebuilding. They have new cars, new houses. They don't want to think about the skeletons in the closet. You are the past." I wanted to kill him. I wanted to grab the rook and jam it down his throat. But I knew he was right. I was a ghost, and ghosts don't get mail. I stopped going to mail call after that. Hope was more painful than the whip. Chapter 29. Death of a Tyrant, March 1953. March 5th, 1953. The day the world held its breath, the loudspeakers in the camp, usually barking orders or playing patriotic songs, began to play classical music. Chopin, Mozart, funeral marches. Then the announcement came. The voice of the announcer was shaking. "Comrades, the heart of the leader of the peoples, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, has stopped beating." A strange sound swept through the camp. It wasn't a cheer. That would be suicide. It was a collective exhale, a vibration. Thousands of men realizing that the god who had built their cage was dead. I looked at the guards. Some of them, the young indoctrinated ones, were crying openly. They looked lost, like children whose father had abandoned them. But Volkov, I saw him on the balcony of the administration building. He wasn't crying. He was smoking a cigarette, looking at the sky with a strange expression. Relief? Fear? He knew the pendulum was about to swing. The terror that had sustained the system was gone. The thaw was coming, but before the ice melts, it cracks. And cracks are dangerous. That night, the discipline in the camp evaporated. The guards were hesitant. The Urkas, criminal gangs, sensed weakness. Knives were sharpened in the dark. The beast was waking up. Chapter 30. The Revolt. The Blood Debt. It happened 2 months later. A spark, a guard hitting a woman prisoner in the adjacent camp, ignited the powder keg. The Kengir uprising had begun. The fences were torn down, the watchtowers were stormed. For the first time in 10 years, we were not numbers. We were a mob. The Urkas and the political prisoners, usually enemies, united in a frenzy of rage. They hunted the guards. They threw them from the roofs. They beat them with bricks. I stayed in the barracks, watching the chaos. I was too old, too tired for revolution. I just wanted to go home. Then I saw them dragging Volkov. A group of Ukrainian partisans had captured him. They had beaten him badly. His uniform was torn, his face a mask of blood. They were dragging him toward the main gate to hang him. Volkov didn't beg, he didn't scream, he looked at the mob with contempt. Our eyes met. He looked at me. The chess player, the potato thief. I could have turned away. He was my jailer, he was the enemy. Let him die. It would be justice, but something in me, the soldier, the man who respected a worthy adversary, snapped. I grabbed a shovel from a tool rack. I pushed through the crowd. "Stop!" I screamed in Russian. The partisans turned. "Get back, Fritz. He is ours." "He is a soldier," I yelled, standing over Volkov. "We are not animals. We don't execute prisoners. That is what they do." I raised the shovel, ready to crack the skull of the first man who touched him. It was a suicide move. But the crowd hesitated. The logic of war, the strange code of honor, flickered for a second. "Leave him," an old Russian prisoner said. "Let the new government deal with him. Don't stain your hands with his filth." They spat on him and walked away. I dropped the shovel. I looked down at Volkov. He was coughing blood. "Why?" he rasped. "Why, Fritz?" "Because the game isn't over," I whispered, "and I haven't beaten you yet." I dragged him to the infirmary. I saved the devil, and I still don't know if it was mercy or madness. İşte Iron Cross of Ice, Buzdan Demir Haç hikayesinin final bloğu. Fritz'in eve dönüşü, özgürlüğün ne kadar ağır bir yük olabileceği ve savaşın asla gerçekten bitmediği gerçeğiyle yüzleşmesi üzerine kurulu duygusal ve çarpıcı bir final. Part 7. The Ghost Comes Home, Chapter 31, The Thaw, 1955. The change didn't come with guns, but with a signature on a piece of paper in Moscow. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer had come to the Kremlin. The old fox had negotiated the impossible, the release of the last 10,000 German POWs. When the news reached Camp 168, there was no cheering. We were too broken for joy. We were men who had been carved out of wood and ice for 12 years. The gates opened on a grey Tuesday morning. I stood in the assembly yard, clutching a small wooden box containing my spoon and a few letters I had written but never sent. I looked at the barbed wire that had defined my horizon for a decade. I looked at the watchtower where Volkov used to stand. I felt a strange panic. The cage was terrible, but the cage was familiar. The world outside was terrifyingly vast. "Move, Weber," a fellow prisoner nudged me. "We are going home." Home. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I was 35 years old, but I looked 60. My teeth were gone or broken. My back was bent. My soul was a dried riverbed. I wasn't walking toward freedom. I was walking toward a life I no longer knew how to live. Chapter 32. The Last Game. Before the convoy of trucks left, I did something madness dictated. I slipped away from the group and walked to a small wooden cottage near the edge of the settlement. It was where the retired officers lived. I knocked on the door. Volkov opened it. He was wearing civilian clothes, a shapeless grey sweater and baggy trousers. He looked smaller without his uniform. Older, he smelled of cheap vodka and stale tobacco. He didn't look surprised to see me. He stepped aside. On his table, the chessboard was already set. "One last game, Fritz?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "One last game, Major," I replied. We played in silence. The clock on the wall ticked, a sound that used to drive me crazy, but now felt like a heartbeat. I played aggressively. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't play for a draw. I sacrificed my bishop. I pushed my rooks. I cornered his king. Volkov stared at the board. He smiled, a genuine sad smile. You were always better than me, he whispered. You just hid it to stay alive. Checkmate, I said softly. I stood up. Volkov didn't move. He looked at the pieces. Go, he said, not looking at me. Go back to your mountains. But remember, Fritz, the ice is in your blood now. You will never be warm again. I left him sitting there, a king without a kingdom, staring at a wooden board in a frozen wasteland. Chapter 33. The train home. The train ride was a blur of changing landscapes. We crossed the endless steppes, the Ural Mountains, the plains of Poland. At the border of East and West Germany, everything changed. We stopped at a station. Women in colourful dresses, reds, yellows, blues, were waiting on the platform. They threw flowers into the windows. They handed us chocolate, real chocolate. I put a piece in my mouth. The sweetness was so intense it made me nauseous. I spat it out. My body rejected the luxury. I looked at my reflection in the window. A stranger stared back. Hollow eyes, shaved head, growing out grey, a scar running down my cheek. The other men were crying, hugging each other. Germany, we are in Germany. I felt nothing. I felt like an astronaut returning to Earth after 1,000 years. The gravity was too heavy. The colours were too bright. We passed cities that were rebuilding, cranes everywhere, new buildings rising from the rubble. The economic miracle. They had moved on. They had buried the war under concrete and glass, and here we were, the ghosts returning from the grave to remind them of their sins. Chapter 34. Strangers in the Night. I arrived in my Bavarian village at dusk. It was raining. The village had changed. The roads were paved. There were cars, shiny Volkswagen Beetles, parked in the square. A neon sign buzzed over the bakery. I walked up the hill to my mother's house. My boots, Soviet-issue leather, clicked loudly on the cobblestones. The house looked the same. Smoke rose from the chimney. I knocked. My hand was shaking uncontrollably. The door opened. An old woman stood there. She was tiny, shrunken by age. Her hair was white. She looked at me. Her eyes scanned my rags, my face. There was no recognition. Yes? She asked. Can I help you, sir? We have no money for beggars. My heart shattered into a million frozen shards. Mama, I whispered, it's Fritz. She froze. She dropped the dishcloth she was holding. She reached out a trembling hand and touched my face. She traced the scar. She looked into my eyes. Then, she screamed. It wasn't a scream of joy. It was a scream of pure, agonizing grief. It was the sound of a mother realizing that her son had died, and this skeleton standing before her was just the husk left behind. She hugged me. She smelled of lavender and old age. I waited. She sobbed into my chest. Everyone said you were dead, but I kept the candle burning. I held her. But as I looked over her shoulder at the warm, cozy living room, I realized Volkov was right. I was home, but I wasn't here. Part of me was still standing in the snow at Camp 168. Chapter 35. The Iron Cross of Ice, 1985. I am an old man now. I sit in my armchair by the window, looking out at the Alps. The doctors say I have a heart condition. They say my circulation is bad. They don't understand. I am cold. I have been cold since 1942. I wear 3 sweaters. I keep the fire roaring in the fireplace, even in July. But the chill is deep inside, wrapped around my bones like a wire. I never married. Who could love a man who screams in his sleep? Who could love a man who hoards bread crusts under his pillow? Sometimes I go hunting. I take my old rifle, a new one, but the bolt action feels the same, and walk into the forest. I sit in the snow for hours. I slow my heart rate. I become the rock. A stag steps into the clearing, magnificent, proud, breath steaming in the air. I look through the scope. The crosshairs settle on its heart. I hold my breath. My finger tightens on the trigger, but I never shoot. I just watch. I watch the life, the heat, the beauty of it. I lower the rifle. Run, I whisper. Run before the winter catches you. I look down at my chest. There are no medals there, no Iron Cross. My medal is invisible. It is a cross made of ice, pinned to my soul by the white ghost of Stalingrad. It weighs 1,000 tons. The sun is setting, the shadows are getting long. Soon the dark will come. I am not afraid of the dark anymore. I close my eyes. I can see the snow falling on the Volga. I can hear Hans laughing. I can hear the train wheels turning. Davai, Fritz, Davai. The war is finally over. Chapter 33, The Train Home. The train ride was a blur of changing landscapes. We crossed the endless steppes, the Ural Mountains, the plains of Poland. At the border of East and West Germany, everything changed. We stopped at a station. Women in colourful dresses, reds, yellows, blues, were waiting on the platform. They threw flowers into the windows. They handed us chocolate. Real chocolate. I put a piece in my mouth. The sweetness was so intense it made me nauseous. I spat it out. My body rejected the luxury. I looked at my reflection in the window. A stranger stared back, hollow eyes, shaved head growing out grey. A scar running down my cheek. The other men were crying, hugging each other. Germany, we are in Germany. I felt nothing. I felt like an astronaut returning to Earth after 1,000 years. The gravity was too heavy, the colors were too bright. We passed cities that were rebuilding, cranes everywhere, new buildings rising from the rubble, the economic miracle. They had moved on, they had buried the war under concrete and glass. And here we were, the ghosts returning from the grave to remind them of their sins. Chapter 34. Strangers in the Night. I arrived in my Bavarian village at dusk. It was raining. The village had changed. The roads were paved. There were cars, shiny Volkswagen Beetles parked in the square. A neon sign buzzed over the bakery. I walked up the hill to my mother's house. My boots, Soviet-issue leather, clicked loudly on the cobblestones. The house looked the same. Smoke rose from the chimney. I knocked. My hand was shaking uncontrollably. The door opened. An old woman stood there. She was tiny, shrunken by age. Her hair was white. She looked at me. Her eyes scanned my rags, my face. There was no recognition. "Yes," she asked. "Can I help you, sir? We have no money for beggars." My heart shattered into a million frozen shards. "Mama," I whispered, "it's Fritz." She froze. She dropped the dishcloth she was holding. She reached out a trembling hand and touched my face. She traced the scar. She looked into my eyes. Then she screamed. It wasn't a scream of joy. It was a scream of pure, agonizing grief. It was the sound of a mother realizing that her son had died. And this skeleton standing before her was just the husk left behind. She hugged me. She smelled of lavender and old age. I waited. She sobbed into my chest. "Everyone said you were dead, but I kept the candle burning." I held her. But as I looked over her shoulder at the warm, cozy living room, I realized Volkov was right. I was home, but I wasn't here. Part of me was still standing in the snow at Camp 168.